Welcome everybody. It's 12 o'clock and we are starting the Lindholmen Democracy Talk, which today has the heading Protecting the Truthkeepers. My name is Urban Strandberg. I'm the co-founder and managing director of the International Youth Think Tank. And today we are providing you with very fresh ideas about how to handle what some call the truth crisis which we live in. And in particular, to handle the problems that journalists all over the globe are facing when different actors are trying to influence what they're doing. And since journalists are the backbone of a democracy, we think that we need to be safeguarding the journalists. Today we are particularly happy about having a special guest with us, and that is Vera Jourova, which is the Vice President of the European Commission. And I will quite soon welcome her more and ask her to start the event with a keynote. But first, a few words about the IYTT, what that is all about. So here you see young people who came to our last year's conference, 24 people from different countries spread all over Europe, and they were productive during a 4-day conference with the task of producing tangible proposal to energize democracy. And we have a method to make this come true. We call it the bottom-up policy advice loop, because in comparison to other youth organizations, we are defining our youth as experts, not for themselves, and we are engaging them not for their own sake, but we define them as experts. You know, every now and then people are joking with young people when they are suggesting things. Adults like myself would say, well, we have already tried what you are saying. You are trying to reinvent the wheel. I say that it is good to reinvent the wheel a little bit every now and then. And that's why we train our youth to be experts. So now I will shortly display our bottom-up policy advice loop, which describes how we come up with sound policy proposals. So by the bottom of this model, you find the annual youth conference, which I just described, which is open for for application for whoever is in between 18 and 24. And the 3 years that we have this organization up and running, we have been so happy of receiving around 200 applications for each conference. And this year, for instance, the applications come from 42 countries. So the 4-day conference results in policy proposals. That is the second thing that you see in the loop. So but by the end of the conference, the proposal was presented to an audience and in the preliminary conference report. The third thing you see in the loop is the final conference report. So 3 months after the conference, the youth has finalized the proposal of the conference. Then to bring in some substance, more substance to the proposal, we ask researchers to do research overviews of one of the proposals from the conference, which, as you can see in the model, leads up to a working paper. And we engage our youth in this process, so they have a dialogue with the researcher also around the working paper. And then on the grounds of the research, they draft the policy brief. Now you can see at top of the model, because you know, policy brief is the thing to write if you want to be influential, if you want to have the possibility of powerful people listening to you. But then we bring in other views, because we have something which is called the IYTT European Youth Panel. And that panel is youth from all over Europe who originally applied to the conference but didn't come to the conference. But we asked them, why don't you stay engaged in what we are doing? We will send out questions to you and you will give your ideas, and that we do. So, well, we have ideas for the policy brief from that group too. Finally, and not the least, we organize citizens panels. We want to reach out to engaged communities all around Europe and ask citizens who engage in their matters, why don't they give their views on what we are doing? So we had a citizens panel, for example, in Gothenburg this June, meeting with 8 women in a suburb of Gothenburg, and was given additional advice on how to draft the policy brief that you eventually we have by the end of this loop. And you know, what we then is that we present the results for audiences like this one that you are today. And sorry, there seems to be some technical problem here. Anyway, so this is how the IYTT is working. And today's presentation will be giving examples of what I have been describing in this loop of hours. So there will be a set of presentations, and by the end we will have a Q&A session in which everybody who is in the room today and you who are participating through the live stream it will be possible for all of you to come in with comments and questions by the end of today's event. So this was the background of the IYTT. So now it's high time to present the first speaker of today, which I'm so proud, Vera Jourova, who is a Czech politician and lawyer, and who is the Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, and has been in the former term, she was EU Commissioner for Justice, Consumers and Gender Equality. Vera, we are so happy that you are here today, and the floor will be yours now, and we are so happy that you will stay along and listen to the continued presentations and be part of the ending Q&A in this hour-long launch event. Vera, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Urban. Good afternoon, everyone online and also in Lindholmen. Happy to be with you. Unhappy Cecilia is not with us, so give her my best regards and tell her that we need to really meet as soon as possible and have coffee and good chat. You said at the beginning that the group of young people, your think tank and the community you are creating has been set up to energize democracy. I am so happy to hear that, and I will stay with you so that you energize me, because I need to hear your views. I would never say that somebody is inventing the wheel, because there are many ways how to help democracy to survive and to nurture. So really, I'll be curious about your ideas. When I was as young as most of you, I still lived in communist Czechoslovakia before 1989. So I still remember how it feels to live in the society where there is just one official truth, one doctrine. Everybody who dared to deviate from this doctrine was facing repression. And there was that motto that brought into practice that 100 times repeated lie is becoming the truth. It was what the communists had as a slogan. Not as an open slogan, but it worked like that. And our hero, Václav Havel, the president after the 1989, who is also at the back on my wall, who I consult very often with, he had a slogan. It was presidential slogan that love and truth must defeat hate and lie. And now when I work here in the Commission in my agenda of values, dealing with the fight against disinformation and hate, especially online, I very often think about this slogan, and I very often promise to Václav Havel and to many others, Europeans who want to live in a good society where there is a respect for individual rights and individual people's dignity. I promise that I will do everything to make this happen, and not to let hate and lie to be winning. It is connected with the topic of today. It's the media role. Media role is to, as one of the pillars of democratic society, the role is to deliver the truth, facts, evidence to the citizens, so that they can make free and independent and autonomous choices. Already before pandemic, media sector in Europe and journalists themselves were under pressure. Economic pressure, because also the advertisers have shifted their money to Google and other big online systems, and the advertisers' money is missing in the traditional media sector. Political pressure, and it's connected with the economic pressure. The weaker the media are economically, the easier targets they are for politicization and political pressures. And security. And this is what I want to speak more about now, because every evening when I open the messages from the Protect the Journalists organization, I see a lot of injuries and murders around the world. Unfortunately, also I saw the cases of European journalists, and I care about all the journalists. It doesn't matter whether they are external or European, but especially my role is to protect the journalists in the EU. We have two well-known cases of murdered journalists, Jan Kuciak in Slovakia and Daphne Caruana Galizia, whose families I met. And I promised to them that I will do more to protect the journalists, because their beloved ones, Daphne and Jan, were doing their job very well, and that's why they were dangerous for the corrupted people and dangerous mafia networks. We have several other murdered journalists. We had Charlie Hebdo case, a horrible tragedy. So we see that this is a very risky job to be a journalist in Europe. Also, we have a lot of injured journalists and attacked journalists. Last year, we recorded more than 900 cases of attacked journalists, especially in the protests, in the demonstrations. In some cases, even attacked by the police corps themselves. So a lot of evidence and a lot of really serious impulses we had to issue the recommendation to the member states to act and put forward a series of measures they should take to improve the safety of journalists in the EU. Especially the female journalists who are under special, especially brutal attacks, especially in the online sphere. What we want the member states of the EU to do, to vigorously investigate and prosecute all criminal acts against journalists. In case there are some international networks of criminals attacking the journalists or sending threats to journalists, we are offering Europol and Eurojust to be engaged also in the investigations. Member states should promote better cooperation between police and media bodies to address the threats faced by journalists. They should provide personal protection to journalists whose safety is at risk. Those murdered journalists announced the threats, had announced the threats before they were murdered, and these announcements were underestimated. So these are really deadly lessons to be taken seriously. A practical idea is that member states should ensure creation of independent national support services, including helplines, legal advice, psychological support, and shelters for journalists facing threats. Also, the online platforms should cooperate more with the organizations representing journalists, because they have the possibility to act when they see threats online. They can act. They can announce to police these cases when these are really serious threats. What I hear from journalists, there is still lack of cooperation in this direction. Also, relevant national cybersecurity bodies should, upon request, assist journalists who seek to determine whether their devices or online accounts have been compromised. So expert help with the technologies. I'm convinced that all this will make a difference because we will vigorously monitor and promote actions in the member states. You might know that when we issue recommendation, this is non-legally binding tool. Why not directive or regulation where the EU can order things? Well, because the competencies of the EU are rather weak, and so we could only come with a recommendation. But that's why I am preparing the legislation which will give the EU more power to act also by means of legal procedures when we see that the media situation in some member states is worsening. I will propose in the next year the so-called Media Freedom Act, which will recognize the role of media in the EU as the democratic pillars, which will increase the protection side, which will increase the care of or the measures to guarantee independence of media in the member states. So wish me good luck because this is uncharted territory, and I guess the member states will refer to subsidiarity and the lack of legal competencies of the EU. But when I hear all the calls on the EU to act, to protect the media, when I see the important role of media in democratic society, and when I look into the legislation, I see that at this moment, we protect the media actors on the European single market as if they are the same as producers of shoes or tables. We do not recognize special role of media, and this has to be changed. That's why I decided to propose this Media Freedom Act together with my French colleague Thierry Breton, who is responsible for media as well. We are also supporting by means of EU funding the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, which is helping the journalists who are under threats. We have also started funding of some shelters for journalists. We are promoting cross-border investigative journalism and partnerships. So we are doing a lot of things also with the EU money. And we recommended the member states to use part of the recovery money after COVID and also during the COVID pandemic to support by state aid systems or schemes the media sector. With regret, I have to say that those countries where the media situation was not that bad, they opened these subsidies, these possibilities to use the EU money. And in the states where there is a varying situation of the member states, the media state remained without any state support. So this is the bitter reality of today. We also engage abroad. We want the EU to lead international efforts. The situation of the journalists is critical worldwide, and I especially think about female journalists in Afghanistan and closer to us, journalists detained in Belarus and in Russia. We are doing everything which is in our power to help the journalists and their families in those respective countries, not only in those which I mentioned. We also see that the journalists are facing legal threats. So that's why at the beginning of the next year, I will propose the legislation against the abusive litigations against journalists. Again, the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia is just telling, because when she was murdered, at that moment, her family started to continue defense against 47 legal lawsuits, legal procedures in Malta and elsewhere, especially in United Kingdom. And these lawsuits were launched by the rich and powerful ones with the aim to silence her and literally starve her out, because these are costly matters to finance the lawyers and so on. So in our legislation, we want to decrease the possibility to abuse our justice systems against the journalists and human rights defenders. And I will tomorrow have the first debate with the ministers of justice of all the EU member states to explain to them what we are going to propose, so that they know that this is coming from Europe and that we are not decreasing the possibility of everyone, the possibility of access to the court, because of course also the journalists can do wrong things, and there should be some possibility to defend. But first of all, we want to decrease the appearance, the scope, and the number of those obviously abusive litigations. And last but not least, we see how important the role of media is in the world of in the era of increasing impact of disinformation. We are under permanent attack from outside, but also we have very agile internal European producers of disinformation which is always well targeted, disinformation which producers who know their audience and they know what they want to do, to manipulate, to incite hatred, incite uncertainty in Europe, and we can imagine the consequences of that. That's why we proposed the Digital Services Act as a hard legislation, which aims, first of all, at illegal content, which is not disinformation. I will come to that, because this is the difficult thing. We want the online actors to act proactively against crime online, which is child pornography, which is hate speech, recognized by criminal laws in all the member states, which is extremism and terrorism. So this legislation aims at increased responsibility of the platforms for the content. But we have carved out two things out of this Digital Services Act. And yes, I will wrap up my speech. On disinformation, because we do not want to introduce censorship, we are now working on the code of practice against disinformation, which will not be about removing content, but fact-checking, and also decreasing the financial support for the systemic disinformation systems. And I am preparing the legislation on online political advertising, because we believe that the elections in the EU should be the free contest of ideas and real politicians, and not the contest who can hire those who can manipulate online better and who can use better and more efficient dirty methods like Cambridge Analytica. Sorry I was long, but this is a very broad topic, and I wanted to outline all the things we are doing, so that also I a little bit influence, in a good sense, your discussion and to hear your views and your ideas, because a young generation is using online instruments in a massive way. Last comment. I cancelled my Facebook account several years ago. And in case I want to go to the campaign, for instance, for the Czech president, which the campaign will be in 2023, I have to say, without being on Facebook, according to experts, I have very little chance to be elected. So that's the reality of today. So sorry to be that long, and thank you for attention.
So, Vera, thank you so much for this very, very rich presentation. We're so happy hearing about your initiative. And on a personal note, since I'm touched by having you here today, coming from the country that you come from. On a personal note, I went to your lovely country and capital in May 1990 and spent 1 week being kind of part of that process of a country going liberal, going free, going democratic for the first time for many years. That is something that I remember now when I see your participation here now. And well, please stay on our presentation, and we will hope to have some comments and questions by the end of this event. So now we go to the next presentation, which is done by my IYTT colleague, Erik Torsak, who is an assisting fellow of the IYTT, who now will speak on young ideas about truth that we have gathered in our European Youth Panel, which I described by the start of this event. So Erik, the floor is all yours now.
Hello. Like Urban said, I'm Erik Torsak. I'm an assistant fellow with the IYTT, and I'm here to talk a little bit about our European Youth Panel on truths, or differing truths and the importance of truth. Our European Youth Panel consists of people from all over Europe that have shown interest in our youth conferences, but has not been able to attend, at least not yet. Therefore, the panel is not really it's not representative of young people in general, but rather these are young people with a clear interest in these issues, the issues of democracy and the open society. The purpose of the panel is thus not to measure attitudes in a general sense, as you would do in a more comprehensive survey, but rather to fill the role of a sounding board for the ideas that we brew in the think tank. So it's a way to probe the minds of young people with an interest in democracy, who you might call the democratic avant-garde, if you will. The panel is presently 120 participants from 32 countries. So, our survey on the importance of truth. This was a short survey that we sent out this spring, consisting of 2 questions only. The questions that we pose are difficult, they provoke thought, they do not have any obvious answers. Because of this, we aim to keep the surveys very short, so not to lose the attention of our respondents. Our survey starts with a short introduction of the topic, just enough to put the mind in motion. And it goes as follows. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about the abundance of fake news and alternative facts, a development sometimes described as a crisis of truth. This is often linked to the rise of the internet and social media, a decreased interest in traditional media, and a lack of trust in scientific experts. It is also described as a threat to democracy. So after this short introduction, we gave the first question to our participants, which were as follows. Do you believe that the internet makes it harder or easier to access reliable information? And as we can see, the response has 2 parts, one binary part, in this case harder, easier, and one free text answer. And as we can see from the pie chart, a clear majority of the respondents find that the internet, in fact, makes it easier to access reliable information, which is, to some extent, seems to challenge the whole idea of a crisis of truth in the information age, which is, of course, interesting in itself, and possibly something that my colleague from the IYTT, Joshua Habgood, possibly can comment on later in his presentation. However, what is most important in this survey is not the numbers, but rather the content. And time is very short, so I will just give one of the free text answers given. This is one of the respondents from the majority who thus claims that the internet makes it easier to access reliable information. Given the wide sources of information that are available, we are free to explore different points of view on what happened and find the middle term. Of course, some points of view will be altered and adapted to what the news source wants to highlight. But before the internet, people were subject to those adaptations without having the option to seek more points of view on the situation, articles with more details and so on. This is why I believe that the internet makes it easier to access reliable information. And what the respondent thus claims is that information has in fact always been altered and adapted. But whereas people used to be reduced to a very limited number of sources and perspectives, they now have a great number of different views available. A highly relevant observation, as far as I can see. The second question is quite long and possibly even more challenging. Do you believe that it is indispensable for democracy that citizens share a common set of truths, that is, agree on basic factual statements about the world? Examples of such statements could be the Earth is a globe, Donald Trump lost the US presidential election in 2020, or carbon emissions cause climate change? Or do you believe that democracy could work even if citizens have major disagreements about such factual statements? Here, as we can see, the respondents are more divided, with almost 2/3 claiming that it is indeed indispensable for democracy that citizens share a common set of truths. Here, I have chosen to present to you one of the free text answers from the minority. One of those that claim that democracy can work even if citizens have major disagreements about factual statements such as these. And the answer is, I struggled with this question because indeed, when some people fight very simple proven facts, often for their own personal benefit, it hurts society. However, I also believe that those wounds that are inflicted leave space for growth. It leaves space for further research to prove a point, to explore different sides of the facts that are in discussion. It allows us as a democracy to hear what others think, and most importantly, why they think so. So what the respondent claims is thus that there is in fact a real risk that disputes over truth can damage society. But at the same time, discussing those truths is an integral part of democracy and an opportunity for society to develop. And with that, I will give the word back to our moderator and host, Urban Strandberg.
Thank you very much, Erik, for this presentation. And if you're more curious about further examples of people responding to our questions, you will find them at the website, as you now can see that Erik is displaying on the screen. So now moving forward to one of our first working papers, which has been written by Joshua Habgood-Coate, British philosopher, who has now will present under the title Sorry, there the title disappeared in front of me. Anyway, Joshua, so happy that you are here today. You have done a stunning thing when writing up this working paper, and we are so much looking forward to your presentation of Truth and Knowledge in the Internet Age.
Thanks, Urban. Can I be heard?
Perfect.
Excellent, good. Thanks. So I'm just going to take a little slice of this research paper out, and that's the slice thinking about what the crisis of truth exactly is and how we might think about the kind of like work of democracy in producing truth and knowledge, and why attacks on journalists might be important to that, and then thinking about a bit about what the possible policy proposals I overviewed in that paper. So I should say that, like, from a disciplinary perspective, I'm a philosopher, which means that I think a lot about like conceptual issues in like how we should think about particular problems and what kinds of like aims and how we're going to achieve different kinds of aims we might have. Now, particularly, I'm an epistemologist, which might be an unfamiliar word. An epistemologist is just someone who thinks about like the practices, institutions, and like individual things we can do to get more truth and knowledge. I'll talk about like epistemic things as an adjective in a second. That means just having to do with truth and knowledge. Okay. So if you're like me, then you might sometimes walk into bookshops and wander over to the non-fiction section of the bookshop. Often they have a table arraying the kind of latest non-fiction books. And if you've been in a bookshop since about 2016, you might have seen a table that looks a bit like this, with some of these books featuring it. These are books with post-truth, featuring prominently in the titles issues about the death of truth, the misinformation age, problems with bullshit, problems with anti-social media, a lot of troubles. And these troubles seem like they're epistemic troubles. They have to do with truth and knowledge. And if you start to read these books and the kind of like set of reviews and opinion pieces around them, you might come away with the impression that currently democracies and the world in general is undergoing a kind of crisis of truth. What is that crisis of truth? Well, you might think that we have a set of practices and institutions which serve the function of filtering out false claims, and those institutions are being undermined, so that like there's a lot more false claims that are being spread, and the knowledge that we have or had is being undermined. Now, that's a kind of diagnosis of where we're at the moment. I want to be a bit skeptical about that kind of diagnosis. So I'm presenting that as a kind of bit of common sense. I think we should be a bit more critical about it. So we might think about this kind of diagnosis of the crisis of truth that you might come away from these books with as something like the epistemic apocalypse view, right? The view that like things in our institutions that were knowledge producing were kind of fine until about 2016, and then something went catastrophically wrong, and we're in this historically unprecedented age. Now, I think there are two kinds of problems with this kind of diagnosis. The first is that it involves a kind of exceptionalist view about the present. It sees the present as like a historically unprecedented age, which involves not just new phenomena, but new concepts we have to think about, wholly new problems. Historians might be deeply skeptical about that. And it also involves a kind of historical amnesia, right? We forget that before 2016, our knowledge-producing institutions had a lot of other troubles, right? So this is to say that I don't think that there is not a crisis of truth, but that we shouldn't think that this crisis is completely historically unprecedented. And that when we're thinking about the crisis of truth, we can think about it using much more general tools. So the set of tools that I've got as an epistemologist are tools from social epistemology, thinking about how institutions can go about producing knowledge and the kinds of knowledge which we should want those institutions to produce. So a kind of example of this, how we can kind of do, how the kind of epistemic apocalypse diagnosis can get us into trouble, is this idea that there's a kind of decline of trust in experts, politicians, and so on, right? If you just look at statistics about levels of public trust, you might think, well, the problem is the decline of levels of trust. If you think about that issue in more of a historical perspective, you'll notice that actually there are a lot of examples when politicians, the media, other knowledge producing institutions have got things wrong in like a kind of like quite spectacular way. This isn't to say that those institutions are bad, just they're not perfect, right? And pulling on a tool from the philosopher Nora O'Neill, we might want to distinguish between the trust of those, the trust that people have in those institutions, and how trustworthy they are, right? And that leads to helpful reframing, where we think about not just about levels of public trust in those institutions, but whether those institutions themselves are trustworthy. Okay, so this is kind of example for thinking about like how conceptual work can be useful in thinking about the politics of truth. I want to be a bit humble here, right? So like, I don't think that I've got the answers about how to fix the problems that we have with knowledge producing institutions. What I'm trying to get a grip on here and in the working paper is what the problem exactly is and what the options might be for addressing it. Okay, so I'll go through the rest of this kind of quickly, so we've got time for questions. So there's an idea shared by a lot of thinkers that democracy is a kind of intellectual epistemic project, right? It's a project that aims to produce truth about important questions and knowledge on the part of both citizens and experts. So this is a kind of view held by both like Habermas, but also a bunch of kind of epistemologists within the like more analytic European-speaking tradition. Now, within this kind of picture, there's a number of different roles for journalism, right? So journalism has its part to play in the social division of labor. We don't all have time to find out about what's going on in politics, so journalists kind of like specialize in finding out about particular bodies of information. Journalism also has a role to play in kind of providing for the rights which individuals have to know important things, right, about what's going on in their states. This is an idea that Lani Watson talks about in her book, The Right to Know. And the journalists also have a role to play in filtering opinions and kind of representing the diversity of public opinion. Okay, so if you think that journalism has a role to play within this collective project of epistemic democracy, you might be really worried about the attacks and imprisonment of journalists. So this is just like a set of figures from Reporters Without Borders to give us a kind of grip on what the problem is like internationally. So these are figures from 2021 from their barometer, which is available online. So in 2021 so far, 23 journalists have been killed and 4 media assistants and 450 journalists are currently imprisoned. In fact, those numbers of people killed is a little bit lower than it was last year. I think 53 journalists were killed in 2020 at the end of the year. Okay. So why should we be worried about these threats to journalists? One kind of reason to be worried is that people being murdered and imprisoned falsely is just bad in general. But not only that kind of moral wrong involved, but there's also an undermining of the epistemic, the intellectual functions of democracy, right? So actual and threatened violence prevents reporting by journalists, perhaps journalists with particular backgrounds or on particular topics, and undermines these functions of journalism within democracy. It also undermines this important political right which we have, which journalists have to free speech, and citizens' rights, kind of corresponding right to know important truths about what's going on around them. I think it's important to say here that murder and detention are kind of a sharp end of the wedge here. They're like a very striking version of the problem, but actually there's a continuity of issues going on with like more kind of like low-level kinds of violence and threats, and like kind of more widespread abuse that people have, especially female journalists in online spaces, right? So remember I said at the beginning, we can accept that there are things that are wrong, things that are going badly at the moment, but maybe we should be a bit skeptical about the idea there's a completely novel kind of crisis of truth that's historically unprecedented. I want to suggest this is important here, right? So we shouldn't think that threats to journalists are a completely new problem, but they are it is an important problem, right? And we should be thinking about what solutions might have worked in the past, okay? So what kind of problem is this? Well, it's plausibly an international problem. Journalists work across borders and they report on the actions of particular states. So in the research paper, I talked about 3 kinds of options that I think the Youth Fellows have kind of developed, and I want to see as like first passes here. So one is to explore whether there's some possibility for maybe some kind of limited legal immunity for journalists, which might mean similarly to diplomats, journalists have either some kind of total or maybe some particular form of limited in time or scope immunity against legal action. We might want to also think about the possibilities of building international regulatory bodies which are able to represent journalists and to represent their interests in international discourse. And I think it's important also to highlight what journalists and bodies themselves want to do, and to say that Reporters Without Borders are calling for a UN special representative. Right, so there's a bunch of different issues to be thought about as potential solutions. There's maybe some things that are better or worse about each of them, but it's important to be considering the options and to be thinking about this problem, because it is a very serious problem for the work of democracy in producing truth and knowledge. Thank you.
So lovely, Joshua, for this presentation. I just want to underline for all you in the audience here today at Eldrummet, and you who are joining us online, that you could find Joshua's paper on our website, and it's very, very interesting paper. He just gave very, very few examples from it. So I would strongly advise you to go to the working paper. So now to the final presentation, and I invite Michele Castresatti, who is a youth fellow of the IYTT, to the floor. Michele was one among the participants of last year's conference, which I showed you by the start of this event. He and 23 others joined over Zoom for 4 days and came up with stunning, very interesting proposals. And today, Michele, you have been coming here to present the policy brief under the heading of Truthkeeping and Journalistic Immunity. Michele, the floor is all yours.
You hear me? Great. Hello, as Urban said, I'm Michele, and I'm happy to speak on behalf of the IYTT, of the whole team, to present to you our policy brief, Truth-Keeping through Protecting Journalism. This policy brief is actually part of a bigger project of ours that goes under the name of Global Charter for Truth. This will include 2 additional policy briefs, and this stems from the ideas of the International Youth Conference that was held back last year. So why don't we start with a story? Romeo and Juliet are the youngest heirs of 2 rival families in Shakespeare Verona, and they fall in love, and after a while Juliet commits suicide with a knife. End of the story. Juliet was not depressed, and Romeo did not cheat on her. But that's what you would have thought if nobody had ever told you that Juliet killed herself for love. If nobody had ever told you the full story of Romeo and Juliet, you would have come to the wrong conclusions. So here's a question. Can we afford to know only half of a story? To this day, 274 journalists are being detained in prison. I have different data, but that's part of the crisis of truth. And 274 voices are missing from our narrative of the world. So how can we be sure that we are not hearing only half of the story? In many countries farther south, the full story is yet unknown. We probably know only half of what is going on in Afghanistan. We only know half of what is going on in Armenia. And that is because too many journalists are being silenced by repression. But who is to blame for this attack on truth? Well, 70% of journalists arrested last year were charged for being anti-state. This means that the country's governments are actually the greatest threat on journalists worldwide. So the problem is, to boil it down, that domestic journalists like Roman Protasevich, who still be unlawfully detained in Belarus, do not have the safety they need to do their job properly. The slide does not work. I mean, you don't really need it. Okay. Sure. So I was saying that the problem is that domestic journalists do not have the safety they need to do their job properly. And they lack protection from their own governments. They need protection at a global scale because this is a global crisis. Therefore, we call for the implementation of journalistic immunity to protect journalists and allow them to work freely everywhere. I know, right? This sounds great, but somehow utopian. But we have thought of a mechanism which we think can make this very complicated issue feasible. And here it is. 3 steps. First, the establishment of a global agency within the United Nations. Today, the United Nations works towards peacekeeping, and we think it's time to task the UN with truth-keeping efforts to protect an informed society. This global agency will review applications from journalists from all over the world and would be made up of different professional profiles. This global agency will have the legitimacy then to distribute the immunity status to selected candidates. The second step is the immunity status. Now, this is the key concept, so let's dive in a bit. The immunity status, we think, should have two levels. On one level, the level 1 certificate, every journalist can get a level 1 certificate with proven journalistic experience and or affiliation with a media company. And this certificate does not provide active protection, but signals the status of a journalist which can apply for protection and immunity if needed. This takes us to the level 2 certificate, which does provide active protection against any prosecution. This means that a journalist with level 1 can apply and get the level 2 only if he or she is in proven danger. This is to make sure this will not be abused. And the immunity status should be granted by the global agency only temporarily. Moving on to the third step, automatic and mandatory sanctions. We believe that we want to make sure that when a country's government attacks a journalist that was granted immunity status, economic sanctions by all other signatory countries should be automatic and mandatory. This is to make sure that the concept is truly binding and to discourage countries from suppressing the freedom of the press. We call for the United Nations to implement these three recommendations, but we also hope that international organizations of every kind, activists and democracy advocates will join our fight for journalistic integrity. We do this because we want a more informed society. And we do this because a more informed society is a more democratic society. And we do this because we need to hear the full story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michele. And please stay on stage because now we have some very important rare minutes for Q&A. And I invite you who are in the room to come up with questions and comments. And I invite you who are online by sending in the chat your questions, and I will voice them here today. So, and you could take questions and comments to Erik, to Michele, to Vera, or to Joshua. So please, who will be the first? We need someone to be first. That's always the situation. What do we have in the audience? Why don't we have a question and we will send around a mic? Who want to start? You can start, Michele can start. And you have the mic.
Okay, my question goes to Vera. And I don't know if you've heard about the journalistic immunity idea. We were thinking about it for the United Nations. And how do you see it in the context of the European Union? Do you think it would be feasible to start a debate about journalistic immunity within the European Union?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was interesting presentation, and I will think about the proposals further on. But it is very close to what we are doing. I described before the security to be guaranteed by the member states. The anti-SLAPP legal, the proposal of the legislation, plus we are in a very intense cooperation with the sector, with the media world, and we are supporting their self-regulatory activities and ideas to increase the certainty that the media, and now I will say something very simplified, but that the media deserve increased protection, because the media who deserve are those who are reliable, trustworthy, who are indeed independent and not paid by somebody who has some vested interest and so on. So because we believe in Europe that this is for the sector to do this job and to guarantee that the media sector, in order to be more protected also by means of state interventions or UN or EU interventions, it has to be reliable, professional, and have full integrity. In these talks with the media sector, We are even touching upon very basic questions. Who is the journalist at this era of internet? Yes, so you see, this is not a trivial thing, especially the definition and the proper description of the problems the journalists are facing now, and addressing them with the proper measures. I speak as the legislator, yeah, so maybe I cannot be too philosophical, but I am just telling you what are the parameters necessary to think over very properly before we start some action.
Thank you, Vera. More questions from the audience? Yes, please have a mic here.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I had a question for the last presentation about journalistic immunity and comparing it to diplomatic immunity. And I wondered how much you looked at how diplomatic immunity worked. I don't mean it as a criticism, just out of curiosity. Because I'm thinking, for example, when it comes to diplomatic immunity, yes, we have it. And if the ambassador of Denmark does something criminal in Sweden, he could be immune and so on. But there is like a tacit agreement that if a diplomat would do something really crazy, that state would take them home and they can more or less force them to come home. With the journalists, we don't have that, and I don't think we want that. So under what circumstances could the immunity be revoked? Would there be some UN agency doing that too? Would it be immunity from all crimes, including like murder or whatever? Or so how would it work if the system didn't work, so to speak?
Okay, thank you for the question. And we haven't really looked into that, but my answer would be that by having the global agency, which is made up of professionals, and they select with 2 levels to who to give to the journalistic community, we hope that we don't get to the point in which we have to revoke it, because we are giving it to the right person, to the right people. So I don't really think that we need to think now about how to revoke it. That's probably, I mean, at the start, we'll try to give it to the best journalists on earth, and we suppose that they don't do anything wrong. I mean, that's my answer. But yeah, that's a very good point. And of course, if this turns into reality, we need to think about that.
Thank you, Mikhail. And we have another question by the back in the audience here in the room. And meanwhile, I'll just say that during the last year's conference, I was in the group with Mikhail and the others who kind of brought up this proposition in the original version, and we had lots of discussions that this thing about institutionalizing journalistic immunity would, in a good way, maybe also contribute to professionalization within the journalistic community. So that could be also a part of a response to the question from the audience. But now we have the question from the audience.
Okay, so I have a question for Mikhail. In your presentation, you mentioned that the global agency should consider journalistic immunity for journalists who are affiliated to some institution, right? But what about freelance journalists? Because there are some freelance journalists who are doing perfect jobs. They are doing just as much as other journalists associated to the BBC or to the CNN, but they make just the same impact. Should they not also have journalistic immunity?
Very good point again. And the idea is that this global agency reviews the applications one by one. And no, you don't really need to be affiliated to a big media company to get it. It's based either on the affiliation or on the experience you have. So that if you have a portfolio of very well done journalism, then you can get the immunity even without an affiliation with a big media company. And here we rely again on the professionalism and of the professional legitimacy of the global agency, that we will review the applications one by one.
We have 3 minutes to go and invite more comments in the room here or from our dear participants online. We have another one here. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Frederick. I would like to ask Vera a question. Thanks for an interesting presentation. But it's the concept of truth in a democracy. I wonder, at the university, it is a struggle for the truth. But in politics, the struggle is for power. And as Yuval Noah Harari says, the human being is a storytelling animal. So I wonder, how important is really truth? You have to energize people, you have to make them put an effort into all kinds of things, and you have to present them with a story. And how important is really truth when it comes to presenting a story?
Yeah, thank you. How much time do we have? It's a very broad question. I will try to be simple. In this era, I still believe that the politicians who have as a moral imperative to share the truth, and we can discuss whether his or her truth or some objective truth. Let's leave it for the philosophers. We don't have time for that. But we as politicians always are believers in something. And when I try to tell my truth, I really try hard to have it based on evidence and facts, including historical facts. So when I say that Holocaust was the most horrible tragedy in the people's history, and when I say it just to fight against those who deny Holocaust, that it existed, that it happened, I think that here I simply have to shout, and I have absolute certainty that this is the truth which has to be said to the people. And then there are other things where there might be and are different views. And I am sharing, honestly, my truth, which is always, I believe, based on the evidence and on my convictions. So I think that it should be a matter for disqualification when a politician is caught lying on purpose, just to gain the voters' interest and attention. And if you leave me space for one last sentence, we all should do more against disinformation to equip the truth with the facts and to promote the truth better. Because now disinformation is rich, well-dressed, cared for, and due to our laziness to promote the truth based on facts better, the truth is naked, uncared for, and neglected. And that is my message, that to fight against disinformation, it's not about setting one arbiter of truth who will say that this is the truth which you had on your slide also. No, we should be able to defend the facts and figures which we have collected in our work, and if we believe that this is the right way, we should have courage to say this truth. Because believe me now, to say the truth to the people, it very often requires a lot of courage. But it's another story.
So, Vera, thank you so much for concluding this event with those very interesting ideas of yours. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Michele. Thank you, the audience in the room. Thank you, the audience online. Thank you, Lindholmen Science Park, for graciously hosting the IYTT. Two more things. Welcome back on the 25th of November, when we will present our third annual youth conference proposals. We will do that through online and on site. And the final thing is that if you're on site here in Gothenburg today, just outside this very room, you would find what is called Demokratistugan, the cottage of democracy, which is provided by the National Committee, which is set up in Sweden to celebrate 100 anniversaries for Swedish democracy. So go to Demokratistugan and have a chat with us and with the Youth Fellows and other people. And finally, Vera, if we could add something in your very important work as Vice President and Commissioner, please don't hesitate to come back to the IYTT, and in particular to the Youth Fellows. We would be happy to contribute as much as we can. So
I will abuse you in full.
perfect.
Input. Thank
Have
you.
a good day now. Bye, everybody. Thanks for now.
Bye.